we've had a kind of long list of different guest speakers coming on to the last few calls, both on trauma-informed schooling and also on ACEs in the criminal justice system. This month is a little bit different in that we're being joined by just one guest, but I think this is going to be a subject of great interest to most of you, if not all of you on this call. This evening we are going to be looking specifically at the implications of adverse childhood experiences on the public health service and how we can instill and ensure a kind of ACE-informed approach within our public health service across the UK. And so we're going to be joined by Dr. Warren Larkin. You'll know that from the emails that I've sent out, and looking really specifically at the role of routine inquiry, universal routine inquiry. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I actually want to just pass this on to Warren and allow for Warren to share all of his work with you for the majority of the hour, and of course allowing for some time for questions and comments. But just a couple of slightly boring but must-dos before we begin. This call, as always, is being recorded for those people who are not able to join us this evening. And I would ask for that reason, but also for the enjoyment of people on the call just now, that we make sure we are muted when we're not speaking throughout. So a really quick reminder of how to do that. I think you are all on computers or laptops. So in that case, you have the microphone icon at the top of your screen. It's a circular icon. If it's green, you are not muted, and so you can be heard. And if it's orange, you are muted and can't be heard. And you simply need to click on that icon to mute and unmute. So again, just asking that everybody remains muted unless you are speaking. If you do want to ask a question or make a comment, I encourage everybody to do that, as always, but please do make sure that you introduce yourself very quickly before that, saying your name, where you're based, if you're a 7030 ambassador, which again, I think most of you are, so that we know who we're listening to before you keep going. As we have done with the other calls recently, we have our hashtag 7030talks ACEs, and we would encourage everybody to participate in this discussion on social media as well as through this call. So not necessarily during, but certainly after the call, any kind of learnings that we take from this discussion, let's take them onto social media to a wider audience and continue these discussions and create that momentum. As I say, we are being joined by Dr. Warren Larkin. And Warren has a few different hats. So I will very briefly introduce Warren, but I'm going to leave him to do that himself and then go into a more of a detailed explanation around his work, again, different streams of work, all related to adverse childhood experiences and the public health sector. But very briefly, Warren is director at Warren Larkin Associates. He is also the clinical lead for the Department of Health and their Adverse Childhood Experiences programme, visiting professor at the University of Sunderland, and a consultant clinical psychologist. So various different hats, but all really coming under this umbrella of adverse childhood experiences and ACE-informed approaches. And of course, our focus as a campaign, we know, is the prevention of adverse childhood experiences. And really, we want to tackle and address this need to interrupt what we know to be this kind of continuous intergenerational cycle of adversity and harm and inequality. So that, of course, will be the focus of the discussion as always. But there is also this other side of the work around trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practice. And I believe that both are going to be touched on this evening during the discussion. So I am going to shush and allow Warren to open his discussion. Thank you, Warren.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. So I have got some slides in front of me, but unfortunately you haven't got them. But I can send them on. So just a point of, I suppose, a point of update really in terms of the work with the Department of Health. The work we did was a piece of work looking at implementing routine inquiry, but by using an approach that is basically sending some materials out to teams and seeing if they can self-train, essentially. That had mixed results, and what we found, as we have with many other studies, is sorry, there's a massive echo on this one. Can anybody else hear that, or is it just me? There we go. That's better. Yeah. So the story with rooted inquiry and the kind of trials that we've done is, if you use a tried and tested model which relies on preparation, good quality training and supervision and follow-up support, you get really reliable outcomes. You know, practice is sustainable, it's feasible, staff and service users appreciate it, and it can lead to some positive outcomes. The work that I did with the department itself was trying to use a set of resources just to essentially get teams to train themselves. And what we found is that is quite unreliable. It leads to mixed results. So that work I did with the department itself is pretty much finished now. So I'm not sure if I'm still the clinical lead for the department itself adverse child experiences program. It might be former now that that work's completed. But the latest study I'd encourage you to have a look at is the one completed by Public Health Wales. It's on their website, and it was an evaluation of the work we did with the REACH model, which stands for Rooted Inquiry about Adversity in Childhood, and that was the tried and tested model where we provide close support to services, in this case GP practices. And again, what we found was similar findings to the last sort of 6 or 7 years. If you provide good preparation, review systems and processes, provide good quality support, and provide, allow staff to develop confidence, and then you give them some follow-up support and encouragement, they implement this really successfully. They ask their patients what's happened to them, their patients tell them, and they have a much more productive relationship. And they even found, I encourage you to read the study, but we even found some very modest, encouraging results in terms of reduced attendance and reduced medication use following inquiry. So just sort of having set the scene a little bit, I want to talk about a system change. So I think most people have heard about this idea of trauma-informed practice, and I think that's a great concept. And in fact, I was today in a prison, a men's prison, talking about trauma-informed systems and looking at what a trauma-informed correctional system could look like, to use the US terms. But let's look at how we could improve things in institutions. So trauma-informed services is pretty, I think people know about that now. So I'm going to kind of move on from the assumption that we want trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive services. I think the logical next step is to say, well, if you've got an understanding that most of the people in your service or who seek help from you have experienced trauma or adversity, then ultimately you've got to create services and systems that support the needs of those people. That's kind of the logical point we're getting to. But unfortunately, we're still in a situation where in the NHS, certainly social care, criminal justice system, education, we don't routinely ask people what's happening to them in their lives. Most of the time we wait until people display symptoms or dysfunction or behave in ways that are culturally unacceptable. So what I'm saying is we treat the symptoms and the behaviours and very rarely address the underlying causes. And that approach for issues and problems that have developed out of trauma or neglect or abuse, those things are never going to be fixed by a medical model. Those things are always going to need a relational approach, a psychological approach, a psychosocial approach, ultimately a biopsychosocial approach. So we can't rely on one particular approach and one particular treatment methodology. And unfortunately, the most convenient approach most of the time is to address the symptoms, the behaviours, or the coping strategies that appear problematic. That often very much follows from diagnoses or labels. That can very much lead to a situation where people feel stigmatized and limited by the diagnosis that they've got. And that can lead to a sense of helplessness for some people. It can lead to others being excluded or marginalized in their communities. And it's not a particularly helpful situation. So the current approach to vulnerability in our society is based on a medical model, based on a kind of dysfunction model. And it isn't working, really. I think that's the bottom line. We're not really solving the problems. These problems of, the problems that we see in social care and in the criminal justice system, in health, those services are not turning the tide. We're not managing the demand that we've got. I think, in the NHS last year, 3,000 staff, I think it was 2017, the last data, but 3,000 staff more left the NHS than were recruited. So in some professions, there's a massive exponential drop in recruitment and retirement, and we have a huge problem running services, for example, CAMHS. Predicted by 2020, we're going to have 450 child psychiatrists in short, basically. So there are already services in England that can't operate because they haven't got child psychiatrists, and that applies to other professions as well. So I think that it's fair to say there's a workforce crisis. There's a worsening deficit in recruitment and retention. Absenteeism's getting worse, and staff satisfaction seems to be suffering year on year, certainly in the NHS. So I suppose what I'm saying, the case for change is we can't afford to keep doing the same things and expecting a different outcome. The system seems to be limping along, but it's having an impact on staff and quality of service. So part of the antidote to that, in my opinion, is starting off by doing the basics right, starting off by doing the things that we signed up for. And what we know is, given there's such a huge amount of adversity in the population and in vulnerable groups and in groups of people that seek help, we can't expect them to tell us and volunteer their life experience, what's happened to them. What we do know is that trauma is very common, but it's very rarely asked about in practice. So in short, if you wait for someone who's experienced childhood abuse or adversity to tell you what's happened to them, you can wait between 9 and 20 years before, according to some of the studies, before someone will find an opportunity to disclose. Most people never do. But what we also know is that if you ask people in a sensitive and skillful way, in a compassionate way, they're not upset by being asked. They appreciate being asked, and they then tell you what their life experience has been. There's also some concern that if we start introducing routine or targeted inquiry about adversity in services, public services, that will create a kind of tidal wave of demand that we can't cope with because the services are already struggling. My experience has not been that. So over the last 10 years, I've been developing different approaches which make it possible for professionals to ask about adversity in their day-to-day practice. So my experience has been a small percentage of people may want access to psychological therapies or counselling or bereavement support or some sort of specialist psychosocial help. The vast majority of people are just relieved to have been able to talk about what happened to them. They want to be supported by the person that they've trusted to tell. And that act of unburdening, of disclosing, of confessing what someone's been carrying for a long time can be incredibly therapeutic in and of itself, and can be the start of an understanding and an epiphany that means people reframe what's happened to them. So rather than thinking, I've made lots of mistakes and I'm not a very competent person and I'm really unlucky and I make bad decisions, or it's because I've got a mental health problem or of an addictive style, people can then think, well, given what I've been through, given these experiences I've tolerated in my life, is it a surprise that I struggle to cope with frustration? Is it a surprise I struggle to trust people? Is it a surprise that I'm always on the lookout for danger? Is it a surprise that I soothe myself by using drugs or alcohol or food? So asking those questions can be the start of a really powerful change for people. And rather than creating this huge demand, in a study by Vincent Felitti and Robert Andrew in 2014, they looked at a cohort of 130,000 people in Kaiser Permanente in California. And they found that in the year following the opportunity to be asked about adversity and then to talk to their physician about it, that cohort of people used doctor's office visits 35% less than in the year before. And they also used emergency room visits 11% less compared to the year before. And if you think about the costs associated with 130,000 people accessing services, that's really significant. So there is a really strong case for routine inquiry. I've been doing this for years, and I'll summarise the research. People don't mind; they see it as helpful. It improves the therapeutic alliance between staff and service users, and we can target our help more effectively. That's the quick summary. I've done this in lots of different contexts, everything from kind of health visitors and school nurses through to drug and alcohol workers, domestic violence charities, mental health services, drug and alcohol services for children, all kinds of things. So it's entirely feasible and doable. But as I said at the beginning, there's a process to follow, and that process involves looking at the readiness of the service you're working with, making changes to systems and process if necessary, training staff to give them confidence, because this subject creates anxiety for lots of people. People worry, professionals worry they're going to make it, somehow they might make it worse for somebody, or they might distress somebody. So having the opportunity to practice and to run through some of those concerns and issues in a training session is really empowering. And once people have some confidence and they've tried it, they have no problem making it part of their assessment process or part of their therapeutic process. But really importantly, we need to support staff who are doing this and offer them supervision, offer them good leadership. And ultimately, if we're asking people to use their relationships as a kind of medium for growth and healing for people, we need to look after them, because a significant portion of the workforce, i.e. us, have experienced adversity ourselves. So, this approach, this trauma-informed approach, and which includes routine inquiry, that is about looking after the people that look after the people, as well as caring for the service users in a more effective way. And I think sort of the final part of that jigsaw is let's evaluate it. Let's look at the impact of it, and let's not accept the status quo. Let's not accept taboo and concern, and let's not assume that the received wisdom is correct. For example, in a secondary school in North London recently, a colleague of mine did a study with 286 14 and 15-year-olds. Now, when we first started talking about this, the assumption is that the teachers, the pupils and their parents and the governors would not like this at all if we offered the opportunity to take part in ACE inquiry. What we actually found was, after some explaining and negotiating and managing anxieties, that the young people were really passionate about taking part in this study. The study was to find out whether pastoral services and counselling services were reaching children that have the greatest need. And what we found out from that study is only 4% of that 286 people withdrew from taking part. 7 of those were from parents withdrawing, and a couple were from the children themselves. But the vast majority saw it as a really positive opportunity to express their life experience. It was done in a way that didn't identify which adversities were experienced, but rather just a number of experiences. And what they found from that study was that it was acceptable and it was feasible, and it was actually seen by desirable by young people. They didn't see a huge upsurge in need, but they did put out a very clear message to the young people: we're interested, and if you need support with these issues, we're here for you. You know where to get it. We want to know, we want to talk about it. So I think that's a really important lesson for me, because we shouldn't assume that it's not okay in certain circumstances. I think we need to be brave and carefully plan it, but ask the question. It's usually professional anxiety that gets in the way of us doing that. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to this idea of systems change. So this is the first time I've done this. I'm just looking at there's a couple of questions here. I'm just reading this. Okay, so I'm going to cover that in my next comments. So I'm going to move on. So routine inquiry is part of creating a trauma-informed system, a trauma-aware system, as I would refer to it. I think there are a number of different layers to creating a trauma-aware system. I think it's bigger than having a checklist and kind of doing an audit and saying, yeah, we're much more knowledgeable about adversity. I think for me, I suppose, just to give you a bit of background, I've worked as a clinical psychologist with people with serious mental health problems for 20 odd years, and my interest in trauma and adversity and the impact on health and well-being is it's been a theme throughout my career. It's where I started. So I published my first paper in 1998, I think, on this very subject. So this is a constant theme, and I suppose I'm lucky to have been on the front line, but also then managing teams, and then later on, being a director of clinical services across a public health portfolio. And I suppose what I've seen is all of these different layers that require addressing as a part of a system change process. So having a single service that is trauma sensitive or trauma aware is that's a good thing, and I think we should support services that have that aspiration and schools that have that aspiration. But I think you've got to look at the bigger picture. Nowadays, we're looking at STPs, and we're creating vehicles to bring systems together. And my perspective on that is multifaceted. And I think most people, most accounts of trauma-informed practice you would hear would focus very much on, increased knowledge and skill in the workforce. I'd start at the opposite end, actually. So I'd start with community. So I won't go into massive detail with these next comments, but I'll just kind of leave these as a place for us to then move on to have a conversation. But I think ultimately the community is the place where people recover, flourish, succeed, build resilience, are marginalised, pathologized, pushed to the boundaries of society, rejected, excluded, etc. So I think building assets in the community, looking at engagement, empowerment of the community, messaging, asset building, creating a sense of ownership in communities for this subject matter. The community is part of the solution. This is not something that only happens to people that are seeking help from services. The ideal is that we prevent childhood adversity because it is entirely predictable. The outcomes that we see are entirely predictable. Therefore, we know it is potentially preventable. So I think community messaging, community education, and developing a sense of ownership and leadership in the community is really important. A good example of that is the work that Robert Ander has done with the what's his organisation called? It's a very good question. They sent me a message the other day. Bear with me. I'll tell you what it's called. ACE Insights. Yeah, ACE Insights. So it's definitely worth having a look at what they've done around community leadership. So I think that's an important part. Public health messaging as well. Imagine we're sat in a GP surgery, and instead of telling us about eating 5 a day, it says childhood adversity is really common. Here are a list of things that happen to people. Here are some of the consequences it can have. Do you want someone to talk to about it? That would be, why not? Why not educate people about that stuff? So we need to put this into the hands of the public. Then I think workforce. I think there needs to be a really systematic approach across systems, across organisations, about language, about what level of basic mandatory training people need. Similar to safeguarding, people should know about this because it's about prevention, early intervention, and minimising harm, and promoting wellness. So I think developing the workforce's knowledge, but also developing the skill set in the workforce is really important. And the Scottish Government does some great work in that area. I also think acknowledging that the workforce have these issues, because we work in mental health services or in, criminal justice or social care, doesn't mean that we're immune from these issues impacting us personally. So I think we have to start with the workforce. If the workforce have nothing left to give, if they're burnt out and tired, they're not being looked after, they're not going to be great therapeutic vehicles for change, are they? And the biggest predictor of therapeutic change in any kind of relationship is therapeutic alliance. So I think creating a workforce that feels psychologically safe, that feels physically safe, and where there's a transparency so that we can, not just impose rules and requirements on the people that are delivering the services, but also have a balanced exchange between what we ask of them and what we provide for them. So I think the workforce is important, clearly. And then I think commissioning is another area. So rather than waiting for government policy or legislation to change things, or new guidelines for the NHS, commissioning can change things pretty quickly, actually. Service reform, culture reform, that can be driven by commissioning. And I've seen it in various parts of the country. In Cornwall, the Community Safety Partnership are specifying trauma-informed practice and routine inquiry as part of their service spec. And that, of course, is then driving behaviour and service development activity. I think governance in any kind of systems change is crucial, and having a single integrated board or some sort of forum that ties together senior leaders from organisations with a shared set of goals and visions, and preferably some sort of shared budget, that can be a really powerful enabler. And if you don't have that, it's going to be fragmented, it's going to be difficult. So I think this is this subject of adversity and trauma is a very good unifying principle. And I think it's about getting commitment from different organisations, getting engagement across the local system around this single unifying concept. So I think that can be really helpful. And then penultimate layer is prevention. So rather than focusing on more and better therapies, which is nice and useful, actually let's focus on what schools can do to buffer the impact of toxic stress. Let's look at what schools can do to create an opportunity for a child to have a safe, stable, nurturing relationship with an adult, which they may not have outside of school. Let's create school environments that focus on well-being and emotional development and nurture and self-regulation and respect and boundaries and reciprocation and trust and all of those things. And let that be primary concern for teachers and teaching staff rather than educational attainment. So I think educational reform is a massive part of this. And unless we get that right, I think we're going to end up with situations where we're just waiting for children to develop mental health problems, at which point we try and help them with a an improved CAMHS offer. And whilst that's good, while I'm not rejecting that, I think waiting until someone's got a diagnosable mental health problem is a bit late, really, if I'm quite honest. So I think creating permission and circumstances for teachers to be far more tuned in and attuned to the children that they're working with, and actually where educational attainment is secondary to that concern. And the evidence for that is Richard Layard's birth cohort study that proved that educational attainment at the time you leave school is the worst predictor of adult life satisfaction. The best predictor of adult life satisfaction is emotional well-being at the point you leave school, not attainment. So I think schools are vital. The antenatal offers another great opportunity to talk to parents to be or new parents about parenting, about their own ACEs. And we found when I did this work in Blackburn with the family support team, they ask families about their own experience of adversity. They immediately reflect on their own children's experience. What are they providing for their children? And rather than being suspicious and worried and concerned about social care involvement, they start asking for help. So the antenatal opportunity is a really good window to kind of engage parents in a conversation about adversity, about their own experience, their own confidence in parenting, their own abilities to offer, an adversity-free future for their children. So I think the preventative, there's so many opportunities in the preventative sphere that we have to take advantage of. And then finally, the tip of the iceberg, but still very important, increased access to evidence-based psychological therapies and peer support as well. So the return on investment for psychological therapies, evidence-based psychological therapies for trauma are massive. And I think we need to make that more timely, and I think the return on investment be huge. But also peer support is a really huge opportunity that I don't think they make enough of in this country. I think, we've got great examples from the US where peer support's been used and is used in many circumstances to great effect for very little cost. So I think that's really important. So I think I'll finish there, but I think my ultimate point is that this trauma-informed system change, this kind of transformation of public health and care services, is partly about addressing those layers that I talked about, but it's also about reframing the situation completely. So rather than looking at, you know, the behaviours and the symptoms that people present with as signs of disease or dysfunction, well, let's look at them as, for very many people, using drugs or alcohol or smoking, engaging in risk taking or violence, they're all a consequence of having been traumatized in their life at some point. They're all comfort seeking behaviors, and ultimately people just want short-term relief from distress, from pain. But many of the strategies they take on board are not lasting. They don't sustain. So people continue with those harmful, health harming behaviors, and that impact is often intergenerational. So treating the symptoms, my final point is, treating the symptoms on their own is not a solution. You know, punishing people solely by putting them in prison is not going to change their life chances when they come out. Asking a person who's addicted to heroin to give up heroin without giving them better coping strategies and addressing the reasons for that distress is not going to be successful. So I think, coming back to the point of routine inquiry as one strategy, if we ask people what happened to them, they'll connect their past trauma and adversity and pain to their current difficulties and coping strategies, is a really positive step. You know, understanding the landscape means that you can make better choices and get more effective help. And it comes back to that universal truth that it's the relationship that heals. It's not the technology or the medication or the, you know, the kind of conceptual framework that we're using. Ultimately, it's about relational healing, I think. So with that, I shall pause for breath and open it up for conversation.
Warren, thank you so much. That was quite something. We touched on a lot of different bases, and we covered an awful lot there. I know there are going to be an awful lot of questions from ambassadors, and in fact we have our chat log is growing, and questions are being asked through that. But I wonder if we might want to just voice those questions as well. So
yeah.
Karen, I don't think you had a question so much, but you certainly had a comment to make. Are you still there? Perhaps not. We will move on. And Helen, did you want to ask your question?
I'm trying to unmute myself.
You're unmuted. Successful.
Oh, brilliant, because it's still showing red here with little dots all over it. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, so I made the point that I worked for 15 years at a local secondary school, and apart from teaching English, had all of these provisions in place. Was a nurture manager. We had a nurture base for years 7 and 8. We did transition work with the primary schools. We were working in primary schools with early identification, and everything was going from strength to strength. We also worked with the attendance officers to look at why children weren't coming into school, and working with the parents or the carers to support. And so my question is this: I think everybody universally agrees with everything that you said, and schools have got such an important part to play. But when you're in these schools, and I'm talking about schools in disadvantaged areas who are struggling, perhaps requires improvement, difficulty recruiting and retaining staff. It's inordinately difficult to get the management to focus on the mental health and the well-being, because they are being driven by above from academy executives purely on results. And so when they shut everything down, I went to another secondary school 4 miles away, set it all up again there. Within 9 months, it was all shut down. And I was working with 64 children. So how do we get that change so that all children are being given both academic and emotional support within schools?
I think you make a really important point, and I kind of sympathise with the frustrations that you describe. I
Mm,
think ultimately I think there are two ways of doing this. I think one way is that we have to influence politicians. I think we need to see educational reform, and
definitely.
head teachers need to be given the support and the permission to say, you know what, even if it's at a local level, like with the governors and local stakeholders and families, to say, we're less concerned about your attainment figures than we are about how much time we focus on the well-being of our children. And in
Mm,
some areas that does happen. I know it's not easy, and it's not necessarily as simple as that statement implies, but I think there is something about a kind of local will to test out whether or not that focus leads to better outcomes across the board rather than just for a small group of people.
I agree,
Scott,
Warren, and I think your point that you made earlier about communities coming together, I think maybe the more successful schools where they do, and I know several where they do have that support,
yeah.
then pairing up and you said about peer support, but helping the other schools to get to the same position as them. I think there's an awful lot that can be done.
Absolutely, and you said at the beginning, it's about the leadership, isn't it? It's about head teachers, and if they're not on board with this, if they're not prepared to take that perceived risk of putting a better balance on emotional well-being, nothing's going to change.
No.
I've kind of got a rule of thumb now, which is if the head teacher's not completely sold on this idea, nothing's going to happen. But I do, on a kind of more universal sort of perspective, I think ultimately it is about educational reform. It's about looking at this evidence that we've got that intellectual attainment is not a good predictor of life satisfaction.
Absolutely.
But that's an intergenerational issue that really need cross-party support for. No single political party is going to take personal responsibility for that. It's got to be across governments, hasn't it? It's going to be a 20-year plan, basically. But we have to start acknowledging that when children leave school, they mature and develop at different rates. They've been exposed to more or less adversity. A test result is not a good indication of someone's potential.
Not at all. And I think the why I was so excited to be part of this, that I think there's now this window when we as ambassadors are going to have access, hopefully, to our MPs, to our councils, and we just all keep stressing the same message. And that's how big actions happen, isn't it? It's a slow movement that grows and grows and grows. And then, the idea being educational reform will come in. And it's addressing the very pertinent point you made about staff welfare throughout the NHS, throughout education. Everybody's ground down by all the pressure with staff shortages. So we need to be able to balance that as well.
I think one good example of influencing and kind of policy changes, there's a charity called Operation Encompass that I'm kind of a big fan of and a big supporter of. So they set up this system whereby the police, if they visit a domestic abuse incident and there's a child present, they set up a system where the police inform the school the next day before school starts. And the school puts support in place for that child. So they're not given a hard time for forgetting the homework or, maybe being tired or dishevelled. They're given a nurturing response. That is a fantastic initiative that is now in over half of the police forces and schools in England.
Oh, brilliant.
And it's recently been given Home Office approval, and it's recently been given the kind of endorsement of the national president of the Head Teachers Association. So I'm hoping that ends up being, normal practice, that's standard in every police force and every school. Well, that started off with Liz and David, who ran the charity, as being he's a retired police officer, Liz is a head teacher, having a conversation about what they could do, because there were kids in her school that were clearly being exposed to domestic violence. So I suppose what I'm saying is we can create massive change by influencing the people we have access to. So as ambassadors, I think getting in front of your politicians, presidents of professional bodies, governors, academy executives, etc., you can't underestimate the difference you can make by doing that.
No, definitely. Thank you very much, Warren.
No, thanks for your question.
Hi, it's Alex speaking. the greatest example of how political change can be achieved is the WASPI campaign. This isn't directly related to what 70/30 is involved, but it's a great example of how political change can be activated. The WASPI campaign is to do with the fact that I won't bore you with the details, but effectively it was started 3 or 4 years ago by 3 women who were unhappy about the state of pensions for certain women, and they've gone around to their MPs talking about this MPs, and the government have now, in the space of about 4 years, have been forced to react to what this charity is saying, purely because of the level of grassroots support that this campaign has generated. That's come from almost nowhere. So it does demonstrate that if there is enough grassroots drive for a campaign, you can get government and policymakers interested.
I think that's a really good example, and I've seen it happen. My own insight into the world of policy making has been interesting in the sense that a lot of this is about making people take notice and making people in positions of influence care about the things that you care about. And that's the bottom line. If people don't have an emotional response to what you're saying, and your role as ambassadors is really an important opportunity. You can get someone to have an emotional response to your kind of chosen mission in life, you've got far more chance of seeing significant action as a result of it. And that's one example. So I think the select committee that Norma Lamb chaired recently on ACEs and early intervention is, I hope, going to be a provocation for government. I hope it.
George actually gave Wave CEO George Hoskin actually gave evidence to that committee.
Fantastic. So that's gonna. They're just compiling the report as we speak. So I'm hoping that is a significant. What's the word? Yeah, provocation is probably the right word. I think it'll be a push in the right direction. So Scotland and Wales have both got very clear commitments to addressing adversity and focusing more realistically on prevention. And it doesn't seem, I don't think we've got in England, we don't seem to have that kind of clarity of commitment and purpose around adversity. So I'm hoping that we get that as a consequence.
Seth, can I just pick up on your question? And I realise that that's going back to this reference to emotional well-being as being more significant attainment. I feel that we've covered that, but I just wanted to check that you didn't have anything else you wanted to ask, kind of as an extension of that question.
Yeah, thank you. It was just really to ask who that's come from. So I just want to track that reference down.
That reference, yeah. It was a study by Richard Layard and colleagues at London School of Economics.
Richard Layard, yeah.
Richard Layard, yeah, London School of Economics.
Okay, that's great, thank you.
Yeah, if you want to drop me an email, I'll send you the specific reference.
Okay, yeah, that'd be good. I would love to be able to take that back to.
Yeah,
to
it's really powerful.
Yeah, thanks for that.
No problem. No problem.
Melissa, I know that
Hi, I'm Pam Jarvis. I'm in Leeds. I'm a chartered psychologist and a university lecturer.
Hello, Pam.
Hi, I think we've spoken on Twitter, haven't we?
I think we have. Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. My question is actually working within the education culture. Testing is a very, very difficult situation because everything gets put on a check sheet and on a database, and then it's inclined to be held in evidence against you. And I wondered if you had any concerns about that. I think it's a bit of a different environment to health in that sense.
Sorry, Pam, you mean tested in terms of attainment or psychological? Everything.
Effectively, there is quite a concern about the databases that are being kept on children that come from school records, and ACEs could just be added to that.
Ah, I see what you're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
we do your ACE score when you come in the door, and then we blame it for everything that you can't do, basically.
I think that is a really interesting debate. So I know some of the evidence that was given to the select committee was quite negative about this whole interest in childhood adversity and ACEs and ACE scores and everything like that. And actually, I think it's right to be cautious. We can't. What we don't want to do is reduce people to. I've just said, just giving you a series of comments on avoiding focusing on symptoms and diagnosis, and labelling
But we
people.
do this in education. It's the way that English education and to some extent US education works. That people are categorised and put into groups, and and the other issue which is just coming up is the how the records are kept, who they're shared with, and how they're integrated. So I think there's a big discussion to be had in that area.
I think we've got to be really careful. I think we have to be really judicious about what information we gather and how it's stored and who gets to see it. You know, I think it's part of our ethical responsibility. But I think there's real value in understanding that a child's been through a certain certain experiences.
I'm not disputing that, but I would, and when you said about the GP doing it, that wouldn't worry me so much. But if I mean, one of the things that was there's a test, a European kind of baseline test that the government are piloting at the moment, and that one looks at social development, which you know would appear to be fairly mundane, but we're moving into that area. You know, oh, there's a problem here. We'll we'll put it down on the check sheet, etc.
Yeah, I do worry. I think I've heard about some schools kind of collecting A scores and then categorizing the needs of kids based on that, and that does worry me, because I think ultimately this information is only used, an A score is only used from the context of somebody's life information and engagement, and it has to be an idiosyncratic understanding of somebody or a family. An A score on its own means nothing really, because we don't fully understand what impact that's had on somebody, because they might have had a lot of resilience factors that have offset some of those things. So I think the idea of relying on an A score to tell you anything is most often not that helpful. But I think
we need to get that over to people as powerful as the Department for Education, because they're already, testing very. I won't take your sort of talk off track on this, but they're already wanting to give children one trial tests at 4 and database the information for the rest of their school career. There's something called a flight path that children are put on. That actually now at the moment that goes from the year 6 SAT. But the baseline test is supposed to go into that set of tests. And if they want to do an A score and hang that on there, then I am sure they will do it. They don't ask parents if they can do it, they just do it.
Hi,
so I think that's something to bear in mind.
Hi, hi, it's Alex speaking. Could I just come over the top of you slightly, if that's okay? For what it's worth, the Scottish Government recently lost a legal case, and this does come into what the lady was just saying previously. The Scottish Government recently lost a legal case around the named person scheme, because they were much of what the lady previous was talking about with regards to the fact that they were sharing information without parental consent, they were keeping spreadsheets, and they were taken to court because they were in breach of European regulations around the right to a private life. So the concerns that are being echoed are completely legitimate, and this named person scheme is an example of how perhaps there is too far, the level of intervention is perhaps too great.
I think that's a super important point. Can I just clarify? The reason that I always talk about routine inquiry or targeted inquiry is because I'm not for a moment advocating screening or any kind of routine collection of information without people knowing about it. What I'm saying is, when people are already seeking our help, it's absolutely reasonable to ask them what's happened in their lives.
Oh,
so
yeah, I wasn't disagreeing, but what I meant is
the
Scottish Government were actively going into places and asking questions that required parental consent and able to do so, and that's why they've taken intervention. As I said previously, they've taken intervention perhaps too far, and they were almost removing parents from the conversation entirely, and that's why it's in conflict with what current legislation is.
Yeah, I think that's a real risk, and with this whole subject, I think one of the other areas that we haven't touched on yet, but maybe we will shortly, is this issue of screening versus routine or targeted inquiry. The two things are very different, and in the US, screening is more realistic because they have managed care systems, and they can be sure what resource they've got available to meet that person's needs once they disclose a particular profile. whereas in England, it's more of a postcode lottery in terms of what's available. And whilst, as I said before, most people want to be supported by the person they've spoken to, if you do need to see a clinical psychologist, you know, it's not that easy. So I think there's a difference between screening and targeted inquiry of people that are already seeking our help.
Thank you, Warren. Karen, I just wanted to allow you an opportunity to ask your question because I realised you were having problems before unmuting, and I think you've now worked it.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes.
Good, good. So I'm aware that the 70/30 campaign is promoting making a difference to children now and breaking the cycle, but I make no secret the fact that I am looking at the ACEs stuff because of an adult surviving against all the odds after having had ACEs, including childhood sexual abuse, and them navigating the mental health system currently, and that's not fit for purpose. Like in my particular area, they're closing down the new builds that are in the area and centralizing the services within a building which is not fit for practice and is actually making the patients more upset and more depressed and doing restraints. I've told them, please don't restrain like that. And it's hard to witness, and it's hard to go home. I am a named person for this person, because it's not just for children, it's for people in the mental health team. Going home and not knowing what's happening behind closed doors, and how is this person being treated when I go away, because they say to me all the nice things that I want to hear, but I'm not sure when she's telling me what she's experiencing, what it's actually like for the people on the ward. So I've not really got a huge question, but it's a case of, you know, what's being done about people who are already struggling within the system because we didn't know about ACEs 35 years ago.
Well, I think what you're saying is a fairly familiar scenario, you know, to me as someone who's worked in mental health services for 20 odd years. We don't routinely ask people who go into psychiatric hospital what's happened to them, and obviously there's a timing issue and a kind of stability issue, but we don't do it. And I think most often inpatient care is a form of containment rather than a form of therapeutic intervention.
Definitely.
And I think there should be more alternatives to hospital. That would be one suggestion, that are, you know, halfway between hospital care and kind of being left alone in the community. So there's a lot of models in other countries and some in the UK where alternatives to hospital are used really effectively. But I think inpatient acute psychiatric care is not, it's a scary place to be a lot of the time, actually, you know, both for staff and service users. And
Yes.
there isn't, I wouldn't say there's a huge amount of trauma aware practice going on that I see. And I think, you know, sometimes the staff are as traumatized as the patients. So funnily enough, you know, where I started was in mental health with this work around trauma aware and routine inquiry. It's actually, but mental health actually seems to be one of the areas where I'm seeing the most resistance, which I find odd, given the obvious connections between bad stuff happening to you and then you having, you know, scary thoughts and struggling to trust people.
Yeah, and when the patients are in distress and their thought processes aren't going well, they're being told to stop behaving like a 2-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, it's just demeaning, isn't it?
It's like banging your head against a brick wall. So I'm doing my best to try and be there for the patient and to talk to staff and let them know what they should be aware of, and of knowing that there's an anniversary coming up that will distress us, to be aware of it, so that they're not surprised by her then having a bad day because of the anniversary. And yeah, I know that the psychiatric support is there seeing her twice a week, but am I correct in thinking that she's not needing a psychiatrist at the moment? She actually she needs a psychology input to help her deal with the trauma. And where do I find that in the community? Because you won't get anything like that on the ward. It has to be apparently once she goes out in the community, because that way she'll get consistent care in person, whereas on the ward people, and that's why they don't want to do it while she's on the ward. That's what they're telling me.
Well, I know we've not got a lot of time, but I'd say a couple of things. One, make it very clear the potential for re-traumatizing this person, so that at the very minimum they should avoid re-traumatizing her, and make very clear recommendations and requests or demands even in the discharge planning meeting about what exactly kind of therapeutic support is required.
Yeah, I will do it. Because I'm a layperson, I feel like they're not going to listen to me because I'm a layperson and they're all the medical people, so it's really hard to stand up, but I'm doing my very best.
It sounds like you are. The important thing to remember is there are no drugs to treat trauma. That'll never resolve your client's needs.
No.
So that's a fundamental point that I might kind of repeat.
Yes. So I wanted to make sure that I brought up this bit, because when people are dealing with working with children, it's important to know that if it's not dealt with, this is the outcome that I'm dealing with. So I think it's useful for people to realize, the long-term effects are so huge, and if they're not really aware, if they're so focused on the children, they would probably feel stronger to know, well, we must not let this happen to people, and to let them go into middle age and even to their death with this, because somebody else I know did go to their death with this of old age because it got dealt with. So we have to work on it, which is why this is so important.
Absolutely. I personally think the medical model of mental illness, treating mental illness, is inadequate. It has to be a biopsychosocial approach, and unfortunately, drugs and containment are a part of our system that are necessary, I suppose, but also readily available, whereas psychological therapies to address the underlying issues are rarely available, certainly not available in the same sort of timely fashion. So yeah, I think that's another area that we can influence on. I think the availability and access to trauma-focused therapies.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you, Karen, very much for being so brave, I suppose, to share that experience. And you often do, I know, so I really thank you for that. I have time for one more question, rather. We're very short in time, we always are, and I know this discussion could go on for a lot longer, but I'm going to leave the last question with Linda, who says she's been trying to get written inquiry built into the maternal booking in form with no success. And Linda has a question for you also, Warren.
Okay.
Hi, Warren. I'm actually running a joint workshop with midwives and health visitors next week. Okay. I think I have you on LinkedIn. I work in public health, but I'm just wondering if you could be more specific about what you mean about the midwifery health visitor transition, because none of them do routine inquiry about ACEs anyway. So I'm wondering what you mean.
I can't remember what I actually said, actually, but
it's on one of your slides, I think the one before.
Oh, right. Is it? Right, okay. Anyway, well, I didn't see that, sorry, because I was looking at a different set of notes. But in terms of, do you want me to say a bit about what I've done with health visitors?
Yeah, that'd be useful. Thank you.
Okay, so we've worked with health visiting teams using routine inquiry, and actually that was one of the most successful and fertile grounds for doing this work that I've ever seen. So we worked with one large health visiting team in a district of East Lancashire a few years ago, and within a year they'd done like 1,400 inquiries with families, and they'd had no complaints. People that they were talking to welcomed that conversation, and it makes sense in their job. It makes perfect sense. So I recognise it's a really complex and skilled role being a health visitor, and health visitors deal with everything from safeguarding issues to mental health issues and social problems and housing situations. They do a lot of complicated stuff, but I think it fits so well in terms of that opportunity to support a parent who is undoubtedly reflecting on their ability to parent well, or actually may not know what good looks like, may just not know that actually they might be neglecting their child because they're spending 4 hours sat on a phone and not interacting with the baby and not doing that whole stuff, that serve and return stuff that helps them brain develop. So
Yeah.
My experience has been that health visitors get this and they understand the value of it, and with a little bit of training and support are very happy to put it into practice. So I've seen it work really well, and I'm just about to start working with another service of health visitors who are kind of redesigning their offer at the moment. So I think it's a great context if you do it properly and you've got the time to plan it and offer that training and support. What I do, the flip side of that is, I know that the domestic violence inquiry that I think midwives and health visitors are meant to do anyway isn't particularly widespread, and I think the data for it is something like 40% of the time that information gets recorded. That questions have been asked about domestic abuse. So I think that reflects a lack of training and confidence in the workforce. So, if we can't ask one question about domestic abuse and domestic violence, then we've got to ask ourselves what's required to make this successful. So we can do it, but I think unless you put in the right support, rationale, permission, timing, supervision, then professionals naturally avoid asking difficult questions or perceived difficult questions. But I have seen it be really successful. That's the summary.
Yeah, in Oxford and with the Royal Berkshire, they've taken a different tack. They're looking at the whole process of training their midwives to ask a difficult question and make sure people get referred to services. But they've chosen the topic of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, because they reckoned it was 1 in 3 to 4. Though a research paper this week said 1 in 6. But that would be a study looking at, because the actual process is going to be exactly the same. Well, about ACEs.
See, the thing is, I think that's why I think about the domestic violence inquiry. If midwives and health visitors are meant to be doing this anyway, why don't we say, okay, we know this is difficult for you. We know it's not standard practice yet. Let's give you some training to ask about adversity across the board. Here's a short questionnaire. Here's a rationale and a kind of, here's some videos. Let's give you some examples of how this looks when it's done well. And if you're going to be asking about one thing, experience suggests people don't mind being asked about a range of things. So I think it's a missed opportunity if we don't acknowledge that adversity and trauma happen, they coexist. They don't tend to happen in isolation. In fact, the Kaiser study from 20 years ago said that 87% of people who reported one kind of adversity would also report more when they were questioned. So the assumption that things happen in isolation is mistaken.
Agree with you, but I think we need to find a region to work with, because the Royal College of Midwives makes one standard routine booking in form, which most people use now, but they don't direct the local regions as to what to do. So you only need a pilot of one region to buy in.
Happy to talk to you with this offline a bit more. We've got evidence that this is feasible and acceptable and leads to positive benefits. So maybe it's about some sort of pathfinder work and some greater demonstration across the country that this is doable in different contexts.
Yeah.
Warren, with that and I wonder, would you be happy for me to share your email address then with everybody when I send out the recording? Because I realise that quite a few of the comments here are asking for different things from you. So
yeah, of course.
It's of interest to people to have that email address, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. I'm more than happy to carry on a conversation via email or phone call or whatever.
I know certainly something that people are asking for is this the reference to this study on educational attainment and emotional well-being, and that seems to be a everybody here on the call. So it's the kind of thing that I think we could probably continue a discussion on beyond this call.
Definitely.
We have, as always, time, which is such a shame, because there's so much to discuss, and just kind of looking at one of the last few slides there about the role of the Public Health Service in addressing ACEs. not just at the prenatal stage and conception and early years, but actually, like Karen's touched on, the importance of kind of addressing this issue throughout a person's life. It's never too late. And I think it's been a really interesting conversation. Again, we could always go into greater detail and it could continue forevermore, but it gives people really good food for thought, I think. And I just wonder if, to end this evening's call, you might suggest something that you think, as ambassadors, as a network of volunteers who are all representing this cause within our communities, what would be one action that we could take away from this discussion in terms of looking at the public health service in our localities, that we could, an action we could take on as individual ambassadors to drive this forward in our communities? Hello?
Are people thinking? There's a comment here, Sarah, from Sharon, about meeting in person. I think that'd be really cool. Actually, I'd quite like to carry on the conversation.
I was wondering, Warren, from yourself, kind of, if you had a suggestion for our ambassadors of the sort of thing, to take this forward in the locality, what would be one action that they could take away from this?
That's a very good question. That's a very hard question. I think you've got limited time. You've got, everyone's got a shared interest and a common mission. I think for me, it's about prioritizing how you spend your time and thinking about the impact that can have. So I sometimes, when I'm indulging myself in a bit of self-reflection, think, oh my God, I've probably only got, realistically, I've probably got only, I don't know, 10, 15 years of my full-on career left. That isn't a lot of time. So I kind of now filter my activities based on my mission, which is to see prevention rather than cure as the new status quo, and the fact that prevention is the starting point for everything, and that people are asked routinely in services where they're getting help, what happened to them in a sensitive and skillful way. So I always think, is this thing that someone's asking me to do going to contribute to that in any meaningful fashion? Is it going to make a difference? I haven't got long, I haven't got forever. So is this going to make a difference? So I kind of think, always have your mission and vision in mind in terms of what you agree to and what you decide to spend your time on. And, is it going to make a significant impact on your mission? And if it isn't, well, you're going to have to deprioritize it and focus on something else, because, every day that we settle for the status quo, people are being given the wrong treatment, not being given any treatment. People are suffering in silence. People are, being damaged by the circumstances. So this feels quite urgent to me. So I think that would be my best bit of advice.
And I think that's a fantastic piece of advice and a wonderful way to end this evening's call. We've got an ambassador network of passionate, of enthusiastic, of motivated people who are doing the most amazing things, and some of them are on this call this evening. So I think that is just such a wonderful way to end this discussion. And I want to thank you once again, Warren, on behalf of everybody that's on the call, for your contribution. We've got Anthony and Medway Kent saying, please come back, and I would echo that. I think your contribution has been just absolutely fantastic, and I would welcome you back onto any of these calls in the coming months.
Well, that's really kind, and thanks for everyone's comments and interest. And like I say, feels to me like if there was an opportunity to meet in person every so often, clearly there's a practicality in terms of physically being in a place together, but it feels like we've got a common mission and a common goal, and there is something about getting in a room together and spending a bit of time. So yeah, happy to do that if it's helpful at some point.
Fantastic. That's really, really great. Guys, I just want to end this evening's call. I realise that we've gone over, so thank you so much for your perseverance in terms of time and kind of eating into your evening. But just a reminder of the next call, which takes place on Tuesday. It's going to be the 9th of October rather than the 2nd. we know that we host these on the first Tuesday of every month. Next month, I'm actually away on holiday, boo, on the 2nd. So Tuesday the 9th will be the next call, 7 till 8, the normal time. Login details the same as always. A theme is yet to be confirmed. So if anybody has anything in particular, this theme for this evening's call came from an ambassador. If there is a topic of discussion related to the campaign you would like discussed on these calls, then please do bring your suggestions forward to me, and I'm very happy to shape calls around the interests of those who are attending. So that's yet to be confirmed. Thank you very much for all of you coming on, and I hope to hear from all of you again on Tuesday the 9th of October.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you,
Take care,
Warren.
everyone. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Thank you.